So about our organization, Ikahi Mediation Center, we are a nonprofit community mediation center that serves East Hawaii. So we were founded in 1983 as a program of the YMCA. And in 2006, we became our own independent nonprofit. So what we do here is we empower people to come together, to talk, to listen, to explore options, and to find their own best solutions. So to achieve this mission, we offer mediations, we offer facilitations and trainings, just like this one, to strengthen the ability of diverse individuals and groups to resolve interpersonal conflicts and solve interpersonal conflicts and community issues. So we have this brown bag talk every third Thursday with different speakers. Kimberly is our speaker today. And also, because we do offer several trainings, so we offer another training that Kimberly is going to be presenting in January. She's going to be doing a training series, the social competence and communication training series. So she'll be having 3 different workshops, the brilliant bystander training, the unconscious bias training, and the linguistic reframing training that's coming up in January in 2021, new year. So if you can find that on our website, or it's also to register is on Eventbrite as well. So you can find it either places. So if you like Kimberly at this free brown bag talk, please do join us for one or all of her winter workshops. Okay. So you'll have the opportunity to give feedback. So there is a short evaluation that we ask that you fill out. It's toward the end of the talk. I'll pop in a link in the chat box. So please do take the time to fill it out. It's really important to us. These workshops are free and open to the public. So, and the way that we maintain that is because we use that information in the evaluations to show like, okay, this is how many people who actually showed up. This is what their thoughts were. These are the really good presenters, and these are maybe some presenters we need to think about. So that it really does help us in our grant reporting, and we really need the information. So if you could please just take 5 minutes, not even 5 minutes, really to fill out the evaluation at the end of the talk, it's greatly appreciated. And this is, like I said, this is free and open to the public, so you can always attend next month as well. Feel free to just to keep joining us. So Kimberly Dark, she has consulted in conflict resolution and facilitation for over 20 years, so she's well seasoned. She's also an award-winning writer and storyteller who wants you to reclaim your power as a social creator to make the world a better place. So her ability to make that personal, political is grounded in her training as a sociologist. So she also teaches at sociology at Cal State Marcos, and she teaches writing arts at Cal State Summer Arts. But Kimberly lives right here on the Big Island, so please welcome Kimberly.
Hey y'all, I'm so happy to see some of you that have that I know or that have been in trainings before, and so we're going to talk about power relationships today and how that influences a thing called the double bind, which you may already know about, or this may be new information. But let's talk about power first. So you're aware of power relationships. Some of them are so embedded in our regular society that we don't even think about them anymore. For instance, in most families, there's a power relationship that says adults are in charge of children. right? We don't even think about that. We think that's just and completely normal, that children are supposed to behave as the adults in the household say they should. So that's an example of a power relationship. The same is true probably with going to work and, your boss, whoever is in charge in the office, say, or whatever workplace you work in, has a certain kind of power. So I'm gonna just flag that for a moment, because that also means they have a certain credibility, whether or not it actually is earned, and whether or not they do other weird shit that might disrupt it, right? Like, this is credibility is an issue that goes along with power. So the other thing about power is that there are existing power relationships in the culture that follow us around no matter which room we walk into. So some of the simple ones, like the big two that organize our social world in the United States, are race and gender. So for instance, when Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were doing a public debate, people often were saying, well, she doesn't look presidential. That is 100% true, because there has never yet been a woman president. So the idea of hierarchy sometimes is not about what you believe. Like, you don't have to believe that women are inferior to men. We have a social structure that has always inscribed that power dynamic. Right? So the same is true with race: white on the top, black on the bottom, and folks shuffle variably according to policies in the United States in between. And these things look different in different cultures. There are lots more hierarchies that we could talk about. So, able-bodied is generally seen as better than disabled or differently abled, right? Deaf folks are a community that certainly would argue often that no, I am not disabled. I have a different way of seeing, and the fact that you hear all that noise all the time makes you inferior in certain ways. So there are power hierarchies that exist in different ways that people relate to those power hierarchies. But that is a de facto circumstance that follows us around when we walk into a room. All right, so how does this relate to credibility, and what is this thing about the double bind? And then eventually, hopefully we'll get to how can we act and speak in order to equalize and make sure that there is a shared sense of humanity in every room that we enter, in every workplace that we enter. So, so that's really my aim. I'm going to show you, because I think it's helpful to sort of see a few pictures. So I'm going to share screen with you here. I've just got a few slides. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but we have the chat box open. And so if a question comes up for you, do not delay. Write it in the chat box, and I'm gonna pause in a little while, and we'll have a look at those. But I think the chat box is super good for being able to not lose the question that you might have, or the comment that you might have, or the thing you'd like to say. So feel free to do that. All right. I'm gonna share screen here. I've got a quote up here that I'd like to just start with, and maybe if I remember, we'll look at it again at the end and see if you have any different understanding of it. But Martin Luther King Jr., who obviously had many good things to say to us. I wish we would stop talking about the I Have a Dream speech and dig a little deeper, frankly. But power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So one of the first things I just would like to say is that I think we need to embrace the idea that each of us has power, and that power is a good thing when it is put in the service of justice and love. And I think a lot of times we think about power dynamics, and we want the person in power to dial it back, right? When actually it will be helpful when all of us are able to exercise reasonable power over our own lives and our own communities. And then if there's an overstepping of power, it simply seems absurd, right? And it simply can fall away differently. Well, that's what I hope, at least. Okay. So let's talk about the double bind. So if this is a continuum where the red represents you don't have power, and the yellow is maybe somebody is going to believe you if you have something to say. This is just how this looks, right? That certain people, and we can think about that kind of credibility when you walk in a room. So if somebody says, well, Hillary Clinton doesn't look presidential, that is immediately a diminishment of her potential power in the role of presidential candidate, right? If she is not capable by virtue of the body she inhabits and the history of our nation, she's literally not capable of looking like any president that has come before her. So, so this is an example of this business of lots of power, not much power. All right, so this is the deal with the double bind. If you don't speak up, you go unnoticed, right? But if you don't have credibility and you do speak up, people go like, what is this person, nuts or something? They're speaking up and they got no credibility, right? So this is the trouble with this double bind that we're talking about today. And I guess, why do we need to talk about this when we're thinking about conflict resolution? Look, it is one of the unconscious ways that communication is organized, right? Like, we don't consciously usually walk around thinking, okay, I'm in a room with 10 people. Who has the most power in here and based on what? And how do they organize their credibility? Like, we don't normally do that. But the better we are able to notice that a double bind is happening for someone, the better able we are to speak and act in ways that neutralize this double bind situation. All right, the gender double bind, this is actually where this research came from. And this is now research that is so well entrenched in communication studies. You can look up 100 articles and read them yourself if you would like to, about the gender double bind or double binds in particular. So this is about the thing that I was just discussing, using the presidential candidates as examples, but you can think of how this works in the workplace as well. That oftentimes women who speak 30% of the time are perceived by everyone in the room as speaking equally. And that's kind of hard to swallow, right? Because we think we are perfectly reasonable people. And of course, I don't perceive things like that. Well, yes, I do, because I am part of the culture that, that already has these de facto power relationships. So, so this is an issue, right? If a woman actually does speak half of the time, she's going to be seen as totally dominating the conversation, which means women who speak up on that other end there get rejected. Women who don't speak up go unnoticed. All right, we're going to talk about expanding your range. So there's two things here, and I think these are important to understand. Yes, you have to seem powerful in the eyes of other people in order to expand your range. You have less control over that, however, than you do on the other side of this equation, is to seem powerful in your own eyes. And this is a tricky one, because I don't mean be, have bravado or somehow be aggressive about your own contributions. But here's the thing that happens when we constantly live in a low power dynamic with the double bind, is that we internalize that. We start to feel like, wow, I guess I don't have as much to say. Or I guess since I said that, and then, when a man, for instance, said the same thing a little later, and then that advice was followed, I guess maybe I didn't say it right. Or I guess maybe my idea was half baked, right? So again, understanding that these dynamics exist is an important way to start to reestablish your own power in your own eyes. Like, to understand that there is a gendered communication pattern pre-existing in the culture before you were born, and also since you've been here, that says, you know, there are these inequalities about how communication works. So that is like my first and number one suggestion for expanding your range, is to understand that the dynamic is operating in every social setting, unless it is a setting that has explicitly decided to practice otherwise. All right, similarly, the self-promotion double bind. If you don't advertise your accomplishments, you go unnoticed. If you do advertise your accomplishments, you get rejected. That's if you have that small, narrow band of credibility. So let's just think about credibility for a moment. I'm going to use Majida's nice reindeer antlers as an example here. So, so let's say Majida works in an office and goes to work around Christmas time with the lovely antlers on, and that's great. And people in the office go, yeah, isn't that great? It's lovely, it's cute. Let's say it's July and she wears those antlers. She is likely to have diminished credibility as a result of that choice of attire, right? So context matters, right? Context and timing matter, but also position matters. So let's say she works in a big corporation and the big boss, right, the CEO who oversees, 500 employees, let's say it's July and he comes into the office in an entire reindeer suit. Is he likely to suddenly lose credibility? I'm going to guess that people are going to laugh and wait to understand the joke that he is making. They're not immediately going to think somebody just flipped a cog, right? They're going to think there's something happening that I don't understand. Like he's going to a Christmas in July fundraiser for, children with cancer or something, right? Like there's going to be some, what's the word I'm looking for there? Some kind of gentleness, some comfort with the ambiguity of what is being seen right there. Whereas just Majida in her antlers might be seen as like, oh, she's really lost the bead, man. It's July, and what's she wearing that for? Yeah. So context matters. What is delightful in December might seem strange in July, but also perceived credibility, perceived power also matters in how we cut somebody slack for what we don't yet understand in their behavior. Because I'm sure you can see that if a wide range of viewpoints and perspectives and lived experiences have been squashed for a very long time, when they are invited in, sometimes they're not yet understood. And do we have the ability to listen in order to understand? Well, that has to do with perceived power and credibility, right? So can you see what I'm getting at here, right? That if marginalized voices are invited to the table, but not given credibility, they still can't be heard. So we need to think about, like, how do we expand that little green space in the middle of these slides in order for diverse input to be heard and respected and considered and actually able to influence influence the group, the workplace, the social group, whatever the thing happens to be. All right, here's another slide about the double bind. So check it out. When you have low credibility, you need excellent evidence. When you already have credibility, your evidence can be not so strong because people already cut you some slack. They already go, oh, well, this is an important person. If an important person says this, it must be true. Whereas if a person has low credibility, this is, now you probably can think of this another way. Have you ever heard that kind of statement like, yeah, a person of color in law school has to be twice as good to get half as far because the credibility is questioned. I mean, just as one example, right? So we have popular sayings, ways of discussing this. You know, you have to Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but she did it backwards and in high heels. So, you know, this is another example of how we talk about certain people have to excel more. They have to have greater credibility, greater evidence for points they make. They have to master a skill more than they otherwise would if they already had credibility. I want to just, I have not read this book yet, but I've been part of groups already discussing it. Ijeoma Oluo has a new book out called The Mediocre White Man and the Rise of the Mediocre White Man. Anyway, Oluo, O-L-U-O is her last name, and you can certainly look up her next book. And her last one was great too, called So You Want to Talk About Race. And that book is focused on some of what we're discussing right now related to gender. The idea that mediocrity can be promoted very quickly if credibility is a de facto circumstance. It's already there when a person is born, when a person is in school, when a person is interviewing for a job. If the credibility is already there, skills and evidence and all of this can be less. And really the point she is making is we are losing as a society when we repeatedly tolerate mediocrity when there is actually excellence available to us. Okay, I'm going to stop share right now and and just pause here and ask you if there are questions or comments that you would like to share. So I'm seeing a few things. Oh, you're getting some wind in the mic. I'm sorry, I didn't, please like literally turn on the mic and interrupt me. Is everybody hearing me all right now? Yes, I'm seeing people nodding. But Majida, just turn on your mic and interrupt me if I need to plug in the headphones, because I can certainly do that. So the quote that was on the last slide, Martin Luther King quote, I'll put it up there again for you in just a moment. And then there's another question here. Women who speak 30% of the time are perceived as speaking equally. What percentage represents equally? Yes, 50%, since we're talking about two genders. Now, this depends, of course, on who's in the room, because there are obviously people who identify as not male or female. And so we would have to, ask that question. I do want to say, though, this research is just looking at communication between men and women. And you can reference Dale Spender. I'll just type in the chat box here. If you want to look at those kind of references for equity, gender equity in communication, you can reference Dale Spender and also, why did her name just fly out of my head? Now, y'all have it at Ikahi, you sell some of her books about gendered communication. Majida, do you know who I'm talking about? It is?
Deborah Tannen.
Deborah Tannen, thank you. Somehow her name just flew out of my head. There we go. So you could reference those things. Oh, wait, I'm gonna. Somehow did not type to everyone. Are there other questions right now?
I just, for me, I think there are people I find credible and I think are generally seen as credible that do not necessarily have power, position, or privilege. So they're not inextricably linked, although they obviously frequently occur. And it's
So give me an example. Can you give me an example? And let me just say, Majida, can you put that information I just sent to you privately? Thank you. I couldn't figure out how to do that. Can you give me an example of someone like that?
Well, I think when you think of power, so far our discussions of power have somewhat been linked to position. And I think that there are all sorts of different powers. I mean, there's even the power to say no, or the power to make you look bad if you're using your power on me. So I think the varieties of power, again, aren't necessarily linked to position. I mean, there's
That's
just
absolutely true. But this double bind thing is talking about in public, right? Like, what kind of credibility do we have when we are speaking? It could actually be in family dynamics as well, but mainly in public situations. Did you think of an example of somebody who you think has credibility but doesn't have any of those power markers?
I think sometimes of elders that don't necessarily, some of them don't necessarily have position, or at least not position in the same sense as being a boss of something.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I realize these are frequently in sync and related, but it just struck me that they're not inextricably together. So
no, and that's true, but I guess as a sociologist, I always want to come back around to explaining we're talking about social patterns, and almost anything that we might talk about as a social pattern, there are numerous exceptions to that. But if we don't focus in on the pattern and actually address it, as opposed to lingering in the outlying examples, then what have we really done? I would also say in the example you just raised that depending on the context, age is a credibility marker. In US culture, it can also be a credibility diminisher if a person is seen as old and daughtery as opposed to old and wise. So we carry both of those stereotypes, biases in our culture, and we use them variably. So my question now is, there are ways to share power once you are aware of these low credibility double binds. Are there ways to do that? And the answer is yes. So I've got another question here. Does position also refer to social position and social power? Absolutely. Absolutely. That is mostly what we're talking about here. All right, so do any of you have just on the tip of your tongue things that you might want to suggest that could help create equality once you're aware of these low credibility double binds? Does anybody have a suggestion that they'd like to unmute and offer? I mean, I have some, but I would like to know yours first if you have any that are off the top of your head. Oh my goodness. Go ahead.
Could possibly be someone with high credibility validating the presence and credibility of someone with low. So asking, say if it's in a meeting, having the boss go, well, you're really an expert in this, or your feedback is always appreciated. Could you share about what you think about this? And so having somebody in that higher position actively validate and invite somebody with lower social credibility to participate.
So this is top of my list. So I'm going to talk to you about ways to increase or share power when you're the one with power, and then some ways to build power in general. So the one that you just mentioned is top of the list. If you have more power, you can operate in allyship with others. You can model respect and admiration for those who have lower power, lower credibility. So exactly the example you just offered, you can provide opportunities for those people to speak about or acknowledge what they're good at. Like, I always value your opinion on X. Just the example you gave was perfect. You also can point out not just someone's knowledge about a thing, but how they problem solve, or how they exercise caring or compassion, right? That there are different ways, different sort of realms in which we can build the credibility of others when we have credibility to share. Another one of those is staying quiet so that other people can talk. So sometimes it's that simple, right? Like, not just passing the ball to someone, but saying, yeah, we'd like some input on this. And let me just be quiet for a moment and see what comes forward. So sometimes that is super useful. Was there someone else who had a comment?
Or possibly if you feel an internal power, but yet you're perceived as having less credibility, you could affirm your own power in a way which is acceptable in the situation, so that it neutralizes some of the underlying stereotypes of reduced credibility.
Really good. So this one is tricky, right? Because it does involve figuring out what is the way I'm going to be heard. And
Right.
you know, when a person has diminished power and credibility, that's a narrow band. But learning how to get in that groove, right? How do you catch that wave so that other people can hear you is super important, and it's a practice-based skill. So I'm going back to the debate with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. You know, again, first time that has ever happened in the history of our country, and it has not happened again since, where a presidential debate has a man and a woman present. So you might already know about this. One of the things that she did was to really work on her demeanor, her facial movements, the way she talked, because while that was a narrow lane she had to get into in order to be heard. So the thing about, like, if you could imagine their two demeanors at that debate switched, right? If she had been pacing around and mumbling and saying, not true, lies, you know, under her breath while he talked, you can imagine how very differently that would have been seen and experienced by onlookers. Also, that's a debate where she spoke 38% of the time, right? These are things we can know using, you know, basic timers. I mean, this is not like, it's not like rocket science where, you know, well, we can't possibly know who used up more time speaking. No, a simple timer can show us these things. And so I'm going to suggest also that, you know, she had to work to get to 38%, because that's already seen as more talking than a woman should do in a conversation with a man. So yes, that's absolutely true. Figure out, how do you surf that narrow chute that you have? That's a good one. Anybody else have another possibility?
Just building a little off of what Katie said, of using somebody, attaching yourself to someone else's power, might be kind of going back to the old getting to yes, referring to something objective, or referring to allying yourself. It's not just my opinion, it's also supported by the public or an expert or somebody else.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful one. So look, sometimes, well, I want to say oftentimes, it is more important to forward the good idea than to take credit for it. This is tricky, however, because we can, by by always using the credibility of others, we can maintain power dynamics rather than shift them subtly over time. But this is it's a time-tested technique for marginalized people who want to put forward an idea, is to figure out who has credibility that it can be, like, now over here, Einstein once said, or, if we want to do something smart the way Churchill did, or if we want to blah, whatever the thing happens to be. So that's an excellent one. It's an excellent choice for forwarding the agenda. Over time, I would say we also want to be disrupting this pattern of who has credibility. That's a great one. Any others you'd like to offer? I'll offer a few of my own as well. Okay. So when you have more power, we've already talked about allyship, modeling respect and admiration for those who have lower power, credibility, all of that. Here's another one, reframing, right? So for instance, let's say a person is seeking out like food stamps, food services, public food services, right? And somebody says, wow, that person's got to be like, boy, you got to be in a really bad position to be doing that. So is someone weak to be seeking public services, or are they smart because they know that those services exist and they are eligible for them, and it is one way to care for their families? So can you see that if somebody is talking about, oh, that person's so messed up, they need these kind of services, it is possible to verbally reframe that into, I think that person's pretty smart, because a lot of people don't even know they can apply for those services and that they're entitled to them. And, that's a person who knows how to take care of their family. So similarly, is someone stupid for not speaking up, or are they wise for holding their tongue before they have the full picture, or while they're in a disempowered position? We can verbally reframe how a person is seen if we have the power to do so, right? So if someone has been silent through a whole meeting and the discussion afterwards is like, well, it didn't do her any good to be here if she doesn't say anything, right? Maybe the reframe from the person with power is, looked pretty smart to me because, a lot of people were kind of against her in this room. Looks smart to hold back until you have more power to, put forth an opinion. So these are examples of how we can actively reframe on behalf of those who have less power. Here's another one. We can redirect attention. So this has something in common with some of the things already mentioned, but what questions can you ask to redirect attention, if you have the power to do so, to marginalized people? How can you yield the floor when others can answer instead of you? How can you point out when a point has already been raised previously in the room by a marginalized voice? Now, this happens all the time, right? That someone with a marginalized voice brings up something, and then later somebody with a more powerful voice brings it up again, and everyone is interested in that. If you are a person in power in the room, it is so important to say, yeah, that's great, we should talk about that. And that is exactly what Mary just said a little while ago. Thank you, Mary, for being the first to mention this, and I'm glad we're now ready to talk about it, right? So that's a really important thing to do. Redirecting attention can also involve bringing in examples of marginalized voices on which your work builds. So, for example, when I teach sociology in a university classroom, I often will bring in pictures, like I'll just go on Wikipedia or find images online, pictures of the authors that we are reading, right? Because it is powerful. Authors we're reading are also authors who have influenced the perspective that our studies are taking. So it's powerful to have actual photographs of Bell Hooks or Audre Lorde or Noam Chomsky in my classroom. And it's also makes it very clear, are we engaging representative voices that are important for the thing we're talking about, right? So if you're in the habit of bringing in those examples of the voices on which your work builds, and you find that most of those pictures are of, you know, as they say, old white men, then you have an opportunity to reconsider: have we actually, you know, engaged a variety of perspectives on this topic? All right, I'm going to offer one more. If you have the power, I'm going to call this one strategic equalizing. So this is kind of a put your body in harm's way suggestion. And we have seen this a lot this year in Black Lives Matter demonstrations, for instance. So this is about being willing to put yourself in danger to show that your life is equivalent to someone else's life. So for instance, if there are white people and also Black, Indigenous people of color at a demonstration, we saw this in some of the Portland demonstrations where large groups of white folks decided we're on the front line as these riot police are attacking the group. So this is a profound example, this kind of strategic equalizing, right? And to be very honest, not everyone is willing to do that sort of thing. I'll give you one more example of this. Breonna Newsome, you might recognize that name. She's the woman who pulled down this was not this year, this was a couple of years ago now, pulled down the Confederate flag. I've forgotten now if it's South Carolina or North Carolina. Somebody knows, they could say it. Anyway, it was one of the Carolinas. Pulled down that Confederate flag, right? So listen, she was the pole climber pulling the flag, and she was wearing climbing gear. She was intentionally doing that, but she was part of a team of 4 people who specifically planned for and trained to do that event. Like, she's not like a mountain climber usually. So there was planning involved. So one of the other 4 team members was with her at the pole. He was a white man. And when she climbed the pole, police said, we got to get her down from there. Well, and when somebody suggested, well, we could electrify the pole, we could taser the pole, it's going to electrocute her and cause her to fall down. And his response, because he was part of that team that was, you know, engaged to do that task, he went over and held the pole. Because the thinking there was that the police would be less likely to harm a white body as well. So this is an example of strategic equalizing, being willing to put oneself in danger to show that your life is equivalent to someone else's, even though you have greater social power or corporate power or, you know, whatever kind of power you might hold. All right, so those are all examples of when you have more power, what possible things could happen. I've got some examples as well for general power building. And I just want to pause and look at the chat box. Why, you're welcome, Carol Plummer. What else? What else can do you want to ask about as our time is drawing to a close?
How do you mitigate people who tell you you're too uppity or you have too much power or you're too pushy as a woman when you're just being yourself in a powerful way?
You know, this is tricky, right? Because there is that perception that we are all supposed to take the space that we have been given. Now, look, I want to say this is sometimes a problem for men as well, especially if they are not experts at something but they are still expected to speak up as though they are. If they are still expected to problem solve as though they should have the solution. This is a problem for men too, to not be able to say, look, I don't have that expertise, but she does. And, you know, so this is why it's a practice. It's a skill we have to build to be able to do this. So I would say there are absolutely always going to be, if you are taking reasonable space, there are going to be people who say you're taking up too much space if you are, you know, from a marginalized perspective. But the only thing you can do in that situation is to calmly assert that these are de facto circumstances that we need to disrupt. We can do that. All right, let me just run through real quick a few things we can do if, you know, to build power in general. The first one is to increase one's own confidence through practice, soliciting accolades from colleagues, for instance, reviewing accomplishments. I mean, this is a really simple thing, but I don't know, do you have, for instance, in your desk, I'm going to just suggest that you might do this if you don't already, a little file folder in your desk somewhere where you put all of the nice little thank you notes where you've done really good work and somebody said, hey, that was great, or certificates of, you know, like recognition that you've received or things like this. Wow, if you are in a position where you've got to, you know, big yourself up for your internal self-confidence, that's a lovely little file to open up and look at and remind yourself that, oh yes, I do have credibility and I am entitled to take up space. And who would I be serving if I withheld my expertise in the room? So that is one way to help increase one's own confidence. Also, here I'm going to use the new age white lady way to say this. Fluff up your own aura. Now listen, if you practice Kundalini yoga, it's this movement right here. But let me just tell you that most indigenous cultures also use some version of this. If you think about in New Zealand, you've seen men do a haka where they're slapping their chests and, you know, pointing. That stuff supposedly, if we do power stances before we have to, I don't know, go on stage to talk or argue a case or, you know, whatever it is that we are going to do that requires power, that stuff increases blood flow. It also supposedly helps us to, you know, open up our ability to speak up. You also can communicate to find win-win situations that remind everyone of possibility now. You know, some of y'all are mediators and you already are aware that an equitable solution can be found where both people feel good about it. But some people have to really remind themselves that this is possible. And this is a really powerful way to, you know, to increase our effectiveness and likelihood to be perceived as credible as well, is if we hold on to the big picture that says, yeah, actually everyone's interests here are important, not just one party or the other. You can also use emotion. Now this one's tricky. Use emotion on behalf of others. Now, most people understand this thing about, you know, when a man is seen crying publicly, it is usually not so good. It is not good for women either. Both men and women lose credibility, according to research, when they show emotion, except for when they show emotion on behalf of others. So for example, do you remember when Jimmy Kimmel, that night show host, cried about his newborn son's near-death experience and heart surgery on TV? It became a powerful story on behalf of affordable care. If he had been crying on public television, on television publicly about his own illness, that would have been perceived very differently, right? Jimmy Carter, some of you are, I don't know, as old as I am or maybe older. But you know what? Jimmy Carter cried on television and people did not see that very well. And I want to say, if he had reframed that little boohoo he had over the hostages as being about the hostages rather than being about his own failure. His specific statement was, we have not made adequate progress here. If that had been reframed to be about, someone else, then it might have been seen differently. So using emotion is a way to increase power, but only strategically on behalf of others. And the last one I'm going to leave you with is to build cross-issue allies so that we are discussing not always our own issues, but other people's issues as well. And that is so powerful. I'm going to go back to the share screen here real quick, just so I can give you this quote that someone asked for. And it's a good way to pause, and maybe you can see this quote just a little differently from all we've discussed. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. I'll leave that up there so that you can jot it down if you would like to. I would also like to invite you, if you like this sort of thing that we've just done here, I host a monthly event called The Hope Desk, which is free and is generally 2 issues that are somehow related to social inequality, and I offer you a sociological perspective on those 2 issues. That event is always free, and the link is available at my website, kimberlydark.com. And you can find me on social media. It's been my pleasure to join you all here. Are there additional questions or things that you need to do, Majida, in our final few minutes?
There were a couple of questions that were popped into the chat box. I'm not sure if you'll have time to answer them. One from...
Can you read them? Because with the share screen, I can't see the chat box.
Sure. It says, if you're in a position of little power in a group full of white men and women who are being bullies / narcissists, what can you do to get power and gather allies?
Yeah, well, so look, sometimes the answer is you can't do anything because you are in a low power situation. But that's why planning for those situations, planning to have allies in the room, planning to have ways that you can enter the conversation to increase your own credibility, that's super important. But see, we don't even think that way because we don't think about this low power double bind problem. And that's really what I'm hoping for with today's session is if you become conscious of what the double bind is and how low credibility happens, regardless of how much expertise you have, if we become aware of those things, we can actually plan ahead and strategize so that hopefully you are not as often in a situation where, oh my gosh, everybody in here is a bully and I have no friends, right? I want you to avoid that situation by doing some of this work up front.
There's also another question. Can power come from generational cultural protocols taught from home due to patriarch women?
Good one. This is a really good one. And look, because of where we are here, I am aware that, you know, in Hawaiian culture, there is a strong intergenerational power that people bring to themselves through, as you say, protocols. And of course, I'm not going to diminish that. I would say that is definitely one of the ways that that we can build our own power by minding our work, our own business, our own work, our familial strength and power. The question about intergenerational power and also trauma, I think, is a really important one, and not one that I can talk about here today. But let me refer you to a book that I'm only partway through it myself, but it's great so far, called My Grandmother's Hands, and the writer is Resmaa Menachem, his last name, Menakem, Resmaa Menachem. And he's a therapist, and he writes specifically about intergenerational trauma for Black Americans, and how we get to equality through looking at that intergenerational lens. So there's a resource at least.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I really appreciate you and your insights. And hopefully everyone else got some, it's just like with much of your workshops, it's something to think about for a long time, so we appreciate you. And then I did pop the link into the chat room for the evaluation. Please just go ahead and click on the link. It should pop up right for you, and then go ahead and take that evaluation. It's really short, and we really appreciate if you will do that. Otherwise, thank you, and please feel free to come again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kimberly.
You're welcome.